When a leader of a major national political party dies suddenly and unexpectedly, the normally frenetic, fast-moving world of politics pauses. Politicians are human beings and they grieve like other human beings grieve. But inevitably and unavoidably, politics resumes quickly. And when it does so, nothing is quite the same again. And this sequence was vividly played out when John Smith, the Labour leader, died suddenly and unexpectedly in May 1994. John Smith died of a heart attack. The night before, he had been at a function where he spoke and said, "All we ask is for the chance to serve." A moving and powerful final speech from a figure who had been through Labour through all the long years of opposition. He had had a heart attack a few years earlier, a serious heart attack, but since then John Smith had been doing a lot of exercise, climbing Scottish mountains, and had carried out the tough task of being Shadow Chancellor up to the 1992 election, and then had been leader. So this was wholly unexpected. And on the day the news was announced, you saw Labour politicians comforting each other in tears. All parliamentary business was paused. John Major, the then Prime Minister, gave a warm and well-judged speech. Margaret Beckett, the acting Labour leader, responded tearfully but movingly, and so did a range of other speakers. But the other part of the sequence came into play as well. Politics inevitably resumed, and nothing was quite the same again. A leadership contest was in the offing, and speculation about the successor began immediately. And as the speculation intensified, that in itself fed on itself and was part of the change, as I shall go on to explain. But first, the context of this is important. It is because this tragic event was so unexpected that you have to remember the key players, Blair, Brown and others, were playing out their early moves in the post-John Smith era in a state of shock. They hadn't been anticipating a leadership contest. Now, this is quite unusual in British politics. There is a frenzy of speculation about leadership most of the time. As far as there was in British politics in 1994, it was on the future of John Major, who was becoming increasingly vulnerable as a Conservative leader over Europe. Sounds familiar. Even though John Major had won triumphantly an election in 1992, the Tories were fighting a civil war over Europe. And as far as people were thinking, could there be a change of leader? It was all focused on the Conservative Party. Suddenly, Labour was plunged into a leadership contest. There had been articles written before John Smith's death about the rise of the modernising duo Blair and Brown, some speculation about whether Blair was taking over Brown as a possible successor. But the assumption of all those articles was this was some distant, far-off event. It became immediate. John Smith was a secure leader because he won in 1992, after Labour's fourth election defeat, a landslide election victory in Labour's leadership contest. He had been the senior, authoritative Labour figure before that. To the torment of the leader at the time, Neil Kinnock, John Smith was often well ahead of Neil Kinnock in terms of personal ratings amongst the wider electorate. And when that happens, it gives political figures great authority. Others are conscious of their popularity and it gives them a kind of power. And so 1994, with the Conservatives in great difficulty, and John Smith having just won relatively recently an easy leadership contest, there was no feverish speculation about a leadership contest. And suddenly there was one. And of course, everything changed because Tony Blair emerged as the easy favourite by miles, very, very quickly. Newspapers were urging Blair to stand. People who came to profoundly disagree with Blair and become huge critics of him in the future, like Roy Hattersley, were telling him only he could win England. Alistair Campbell, who became his press secretary, took some persuading, but he did, was telling Blair it's got to be him. And in the end, of course, he famously stood and won, and announced on day one of his leadership in interviews, including one on the Today programme, that he was leading a new Labour Party, implying that the past was old. The past, for example, that John Smith was part of. John Smith had been part of the last Labour government that was kicked out in 1979. Blair, from the beginning, implied a turning point of immense proportions by this juxtaposition: new versus old. New Labour, old Labour. And of course, in ways that we'll come on to in a minute, it marked a departure of profound proportions. We'll come on to the differences between John Smith and what might have happened and Tony Blair. But before we do, it's important to reflect on the degree at first of continuity, at first in terms of the timescale. I remember having a cup of coffee with David Miliband, who was part of Tony Blair's team in opposition quite early on. Must have been about 1995, I think. And I said to David, well, I know, New Labour and all the excitement around it, and it's hard now to remember just what excitement it generated at the time. I said, in policy terms, what's different, David? And David, who himself was a link with the John Smith era, he had been secretary of the Social Justice Commission that John Smith had set up. David Miliband said, well, the minimum wage, the pluralism symbolised by a pledge to hold a referendum on electoral reform, some social justice reforms, and so on. And I said, but all those had already been in place in the Smith era. And it is important to remember that when Blair became leader in '94, he inherited a range of policy changes that had already taken place. It's something I think David Cameron underestimated or overlooked when he came in as Conservative leader and said, I'm going to do a Blair in reverse. Blair had already inherited piles of policies because by then they had been out of power for so long. By 1994, remember, they were last in power in '79. It was John Smith who, with some reluctance, introduced the pledge to hold a referendum on electoral reform. He did so because he knew it was the only way he could unite his parliamentary party, who were tearing themselves apart over the issue of electoral reform. Shows how some passions in politics are fleeting. But I remember one pro-electoral reform person at the time, Jeff Rooker, telling me there'll be blood on the carpet if Smith doesn't give us this referendum. And he got the pledge for a referendum. And that, of course, became, in a way, a key dimension of Blair's early appeal, because it was the link that gave him the relationship with Paddy Ashdown, the leader of the Lib Dems. That relationship couldn't have happened if there hadn't been the pledge to hold a referendum on electoral reform, even if, subsequently, Tony Blair never held it. Similarly, the minimum wage was a policy under Smith, and the major internal reform, arguably in practical terms more significant than Tony Blair's early abolition of Clause 4, was the one member, one vote to elect future Labour leaders. That too was introduced by John Smith. So there is continuity as much of a big break in that respect. I think there is in another respect too. Tony Blair was, so was Gordon Brown, in the early days at least, famously cautious. They were scared to make any pledges of significance on public spending in case it became a tax bombshell. Blair's genius was to make the cautious seem radical and daring. He always used phrases like radical and bold, but actually a lot of the time they were being fearfully cautious. And in some respects, although John Smith was a very different kind of political figure than Tony Blair, had more similarities to Gordon Brown. He was a Scottish social democrat, believed in redistribution, all the rest of it, but he too was cautious. Neil Kinnock told me, still with some anguish relatively recently, that in the build-up to the 1992 election, when Neil Kinnock was still leader, he tried again and again to persuade John Smith to accept the idea of an earmarked tax to pay for improvements in the NHS, which was in a bad way in 1992. He could see a way of selling it that would make that election more exciting and Labour's message to the wider electorate more exciting. But John Smith, knowing Treasury reluctance to accept earmarked taxes, worried too about the impact, tax bombshell stuff again, refused. Ironically, really, because it was John Smith who devised the shadow budget, so-called, in 1992, that caused Labour all kinds of problems when that too was portrayed as a tax bombshell. But it showed that he was cautious, and Blair and Brown adopted cautious policies too in the build-up to 1997. But there is no getting away from the profound change that came about as a result of Blair and Brown, in their different ways, taking over the Labour Party in the summer of 1994. The differences are profound on many levels. First of all, John Smith's qualities, which obviously they lost with his sudden death. One was that he was a great team leader. He managed with a relatively calm authority to prevent a kind of eruption of civil war, which often follows a tumultuous Labour defeat. In 1992, people were angry. They'd lost again. But he calmed everyone down, and there was a great deal of potential for internal tension. For example, Blair and Brown were already embarking on their modernising project with others. They met famously in Blair's constituency house the day after the 92 defeat to plot what they regarded as their way back. They went to the United States to examine how Bill Clinton had won there. People like John Prescott were livid with them. He called them the beautiful people, looking to, as he would imply, superficially change Labour. But they all respected John Smith, especially John Prescott, who could be difficult with leaders. Prescott loathed Neil Kinnock, and it was mutual. But Prescott had a great loyalty to John Smith, and John Smith needed Prescott when he introduced his one member, one vote. And although Blair and Brown were frustrated with Smith in many ways, they too had a basic respect. The other thing, and this I think is more important, is that John Smith had a confidence brought about by power. He had experienced government. It's difficult to understand the degree to which, if you haven't been in government before, if you haven't tasted power, how intimidating it appears, and how mysterious almost. Blair, Brown, Neil Kinnock before them had never been near government. All they knew was opposition. John Smith had served, albeit briefly, in Jim Callaghan's final cabinet during the period that led up to the 1979 election. He was there experiencing the traumas of the winter of discontent and all the other dramas. And before that, he had been Michael Foot's deputy. Michael Foot was leader of the House, guiding the government's legislation through as a minority government. And as Theresa May and her colleagues would acknowledge now, getting legislation through as a minority government is not easy, even with the support of a smaller party. So he was not mystified or intimidated by power, and he was also a naturally confident person. His critics would say too confident, too complacent about the task required to make Labour win again. But that confidence, I think, would have meant he would have been a calm Prime Minister had he won in 1997. He wouldn't have felt so compelled to please the newspapers, to woo the newspapers. I don't think, although we cannot know for sure, he would have felt so compelled to show that a Labour Prime Minister could work with a Republican President, George Bush, in missions such as Iraq. David Hill, his press secretary, who then went on to work for Tony Blair, said John Smith, he told me this, had the confidence of a politician. He said the only other one he had ever met with that same level of self-assurance was Mitterrand in France. And self-assurance, being at ease with yourself in politics, is on the whole an advantage, not a disadvantage. As I say, some would say it would lead to complacency. So those things are inevitably different when you compare it with the team that followed. No experience of government. And also, and a lack of confidence that comes with that, inevitably. But then we move on to more substantial areas. One is the media. John Smith wasn't interested really in the media and how it worked. Again, David Hill told me once that John Smith was baffled when a speech he was making one evening, a summary appeared in the Times newspaper that morning, where David Hill had briefed it to get it some publicity. And he said, well, I haven't made the speech yet. David Hill had to explain to him that you often don't get publicity once the speech has been made, but you can before, and so on. The rhythms of the media just didn't really interest him that much. He was, like all politicians, frustrated by the media, pleased to get praise, but he wasn't gripped by it. Blair and Brown were utterly gripped by the media. When they shared an office together, they used to watch bulletins together and say, that's a disaster, why didn't we do this, why aren't we saying that? They would read newspaper articles and compare notes and see how they would do it differently, and so on. And they were also utterly convinced that unless you at least neutered newspapers like The Sun, Labour could never win. And that meant the moment Blair stood for the leadership, he brought in people like Peter Mandelson. Peter Mandelson had become a Labour MP in 1992, and John Smith had shown no interest in him whatsoever. He didn't say to Peter Mandelson, come and help me project Labour as we try and win next time. I think Mandelson even had doubts as to whether he had made a terrible mistake becoming an MP with not a lot to do. Suddenly, he was at the centre of everything, as Tony Blair, who was very dependent on Peter Mandelson at the time, became leader and saw Peter Mandelson at least once or twice every day. Mandelson faced the nightmare of deciding whether to back Blair or Brown. Brown never forgave him for, in the end, campaigning for Blair, but it's a great myth that he was openly campaigning for Blair from the beginning. He wasn't. He put the case for Brown as well, but they fell out and hardly spoke to each other for years to come until Gordon Brown put him back into the cabinet. And that, of course, brings us to arguably the most significant change of all. And that is the relationship between Blair and Brown was transformed by the summer of 1994 and the events that took place. And again, we need to go back to the assumptions that we all carry with us all the time until they are jolted. Take Gordon Brown. He knew he was going through a tough phase in the summer of 1994 as a shadow chancellor. He felt he had to do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of Labour's reputation to run the economy and do a lot of unpopular things, or say them. You can't do them in opposition. And so he had told his shadow cabinet not to make a single spending pledge. They were furious. They wanted to say popular things. He had attacked Tory tax rises when some in the shadow cabinet thought, well, surely Labour should be putting up taxes or proposing to. And as far as he was carrying assumptions about the leadership, and he always carried them, that was some far off distant event. Suddenly, whilst also grieving about the death of his friend, he faced what for him I think was a nightmare of Tony Blair, the more junior figure in the partnership as he saw it, and to some extent as Tony Blair saw it, stepping right over him and becoming leader. At the beginning, they just about managed the relationship, but it became increasingly difficult. There was one element that Brown enjoyed, which was the freedom to develop economic policy making. Under John Smith, who himself had been a shadow chancellor, it was tougher for Brown at times than it was under Tony Blair. Blair continued at first to value Brown's advice. In this early phase, he once told me that he thought Brown was a strategic genius. And I was in Brown's office once having coffee in about this period, 95, 96, and Brown's phone went, and I just heard Brown saying, no, if you ask that, it was before Prime Minister's questions. If you ask that question, Major will say this. Why don't you ask that? No, do that. No, don't ask that. No, this is what you should do. And I could tell, he never told me, but I could tell it was Blair phoning him up to ask advice about how he should handle Prime Minister's questions. So the two of them got on okay, but Brown never forgave Blair for acquiring the crown. He thought there had been an arrangement between them that while Brown was doing the heavy lifting, Blair would in the end support him in any leadership contest. But they had no idea when this contest was going to take place and was doing it in a period of shock. There is another really profound, important turning point in all of this, and it's about New Labour and the form it took. It was absolutely rooted in its time of the summer of 1994. It was the product of many years of opposition. Blair and Brown became MPs in 1983, where Labour had been slaughtered by the Conservatives. Labour was slaughtered again in 87, and then unexpectedly in 1992. It was framed by defeat, and their attempt to define the party as new was all about saying, right, that's all in the past. We are going to do things differently now. We're going to be pro-American, pro-spending on defence, pro-cutting down on tax rises and all the rest of it. They went into the 97 election, of course, and indeed the one after, pledging not to put up the basic rate of income tax. Imagine if John Smith had stayed on and won the 97 election. There are some of Tony Blair's allies at the time who thought that wouldn't happen. I think he would have done. I think the Conservatives were losing the election themselves, irrespective of anything else. And anyway, Smith had certain qualities and skills. And if he had done so, Gordon Brown would have become Chancellor. Tony Blair would have become Home Secretary. And they would have been different political figures at a point when a leadership contest would arise. And who knows when in government that happens. They would have had the experience of power. They would have known how departments work. They would have seen at first hand a Prime Minister struggling with relations between Europe, relations with the United States. They would inevitably have been bigger and more confident figures in themselves and about their party, because their party would have won an election by definition if they had been in power. We will never know. But I think New Labour would have been entirely different, even if a Blair or Brown had won a leadership contest subsequently, having experienced government. There is one theme, I suspect, where continuity is stronger than a break with the past, a turning point, and that's over the never-ending theme of Europe. John Smith was a strong pro-European, arguably in some ways stronger than Tony Blair. His instincts were always pro-European, but he, during the votes on the Maastricht Treaty, would move at times to defeat John Major, whether or not he agreed with what Major was doing in relation to the then Maastricht Treaty. He played an ambiguous game over Europe and probably would have had to do so in the issues that followed in relation to the single currency and all the rest of it. Tony Blair was similar. He entered the 97 election both in favour sort of the single currency and yet opposed. He wrote an article for The Sun saying how much he loved the pound. He indicated to others he was going to take Britain into the euro. There has always been amongst Labour leaders a deep ambiguity over Europe. It's not just the Conservative Party that suffers from this capacity for ambiguity and much more in that policy area. But we will never know. When a leader dies, everything kind of changes and everything else becomes speculative. But John Smith unquestionably had played his part in stabilising a party traumatised by a wholly unexpected fourth defeat. I think Neil Kinnock said he only thought he would lose during the 92 campaign when he could sniff it. Many thought they would still win. John Smith took over and did introduce some of the policies and internal reforms that shaped New Labour after that contest, dramatic contest, in 1994.